In the book of Judges, God fights for Israel multiple times, delivering them victories over other people groups. But in Judges 1:19, it says the Lord was with Judah, but the men of Judah could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had iron chariots. Skeptics often argue this shows the Lord cannot be omnipotent because he cannot deal with a few measly iron chariots. But is this really what the text says in context? Or are we missing details within the chapter itself that suggest Israel had already violated the commandments of God, thus meaning he would not give their enemies into their hands? Judges 1:19 is often cited by skeptics to argue the God of the Bible is not all-powerful. There even used to be an atheist counter-apologist wiki named Iron Chariots that was based off this verse. The verse states, "And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had iron chariots." The pronouns most likely refer to Judah in this passage. But despite this, it still says the Lord was with Judah. If God was with the men of Judah, why couldn't they drive out the inhabitants? Surely if God is all-powerful, dealing with iron chariots from the start of the Iron Age should have been an easy task for him. The problem with this argument is it is plucking one verse out of its context. Later within the book of Judges, God has no problem overcoming iron chariots, nor does he have an issue with them at the Red Sea. Why would the author of Judges claim iron chariots were a problem in one place if they narrate they were not an issue later on? The main theme of the book of Judges is the downward moral spiral of the people of Israel. Throughout the book, the Israelites give in to sin and worship other gods, and so God abandons them to be conquered by other people groups. Then he raises up a judge to save them, and the vicious cycle continues. The authors of Judges begin narrating this downward spiral in the very first chapter. K. Lawson Younger Jr. says, "The narrator of Judges 1 has structured his account to emphasize this moral decline." The chapter begins with the death of Joshua, and then tells us the men of Judah went out to fight the Canaanites. They captured the king of Bezek, Adoni-Bezek, and tortured him by cutting off his thumbs and big toes. Adoni-Bezek laments that he received what he deserved because he performed the same torture on 70 kings. But Daniel Block notes, the fact that the men of Judah were willing to torture Adoni-Bezek in the same way he tortured others shows us they were already beginning to adopt Canaanite practices. The author hereby declares obliquely that the newly arrived Israelites, including the tribe of Judah, have quickly adopted a Canaanite ethic, apart from the issue of having spared a man who clearly came under the sentence of death with the rest of the people. Instead of looking to the Lord for ethical guidance, the Israelites used the Canaanites as models when deciding how to treat captives. After this, we read that Caleb makes a vow that whoever captures Deborah, he will give his daughter as a bride. Barry Webb notes it's reminiscent of the tragic vow Jephthah will make later in the book, but it also has a bad ending, albeit not nearly as tragic as what will happen with Jephthah. Othniel manages to capture the city, and then proceeds to marry his cousin. This seems to be a direct violation of Leviticus 18:6, which forbids the marrying of close relatives, thus showing disregard for the Torah of Moses. After this, we see a climax of disregard for the commands of God. People called the Kenites were allowed to settle with the Israelites, and along with some of the people of Judah, the text tells us, they went and settled with the people who were in the Negeb. Daniel Block says, "Instead of destroying the city and its population, they settled down among them, thereby sowing the seeds of Canaanization that sprout and flourish in the following chapters." In other words, they didn't drive out the inhabitants as God commanded, but lived among them. Interestingly enough, right after this, we hear of Judah's war with the people of the plain, and how they were unable to drive out the inhabitants because of the iron chariots. But if one had read the warnings in the Pentateuch, we should expect to see the people of Israel unable to drive out the inhabitants, because God said if they did not follow his commandments, he would allow the inhabitants to be a thorn in their side, and that the Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and you shall be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. God directly told Israel if they did not drive out the inhabitants, he would allow the Canaanites to remain and defeat Israel. Moreover, if we read in context, the authors of Judges tell us this as well. David M. Howard and Michael A. Grisanti say, regarding Judges 1:19, "We soon discover there is more here than meets the eye." A few verses later, the authors explain that the people's failure was really due to spiritual compromise and idolatry. Judges 1:19 must reflect the people's limited and warped perspective, not the author's own interpretation. The author is toying with the audience here. With tongue-in-cheek, as it were, he raises our curiosity by giving us a signal that something is wrong, expecting us to object. He prepares the way for the real explanation for Israel's partial success. In other words, the authors open Judges by narrating the moral degradation of the people of Judah, giving us hints that Judah is falling into sin, which then leads to the shocking reveal that Judah could not drive out the inhabitants. This clues us in that something is wrong. Then in the opening lines of chapter 2, the authors reveal the reasons why Judah was unsuccessful. The people of Israel did not drive out the inhabitants as commanded. The angel of the Lord references Numbers 33:55 and states, "I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you." At the end of the chapter we read, "So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, Because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did, or not." Thus, Judges 1:19 in context does not suggest God could not handle iron chariots. It is an expected result from disobedience, and foreshadowing of God's announcement that he would not drive out the people from the land. Even though he was with Judah, that doesn't necessarily mean he must bless them with victory. A common misunderstanding is the idea that God being with someone means everything will go their way, but this is never affirmed in the biblical texts. For example, Genesis 39 says the Lord was with Joseph, but Joseph was still stuck in prison. God being with someone doesn't mean they necessarily get everything they want. In Judges 2, God reaffirms he will not break his covenant with Israel, so he is still with them. But because of their disobedience, he would not drive out the inhabitants before them. God is with Judah, but enacts the curses for disobedience, which is explicitly affirmed later in chapter 2. So to hear that God is with someone, it means they have a covenant with him and he is honoring the stipulations of it. K. Lawson Younger Jr. also reminds us, Judges 1 is not written in chronological order, but with a geographical orientation, in that it covers the actions of one tribe before moving on to the next. Younger notes this type of arrangement is common in other annals from the ancient Near East. Judges 1, and in a sense Judges as a whole, is a highly stylized geographically arranged account. It arbitrarily begins with Judah and ends with Dan, maintaining a south-north orientation. Thus, while Judah is carrying out its own campaign, the other tribes are enacting theirs. But the authors of Judges 1 tell us the other tribes, like Judah, were not driving out the inhabitants as they were commanded. Verse 28 even tells us they put many of the Canaanites into forced labor, which also violated God's commandments about harshly treating non-Israelites. Thus we see widespread corruption in the land, where Israel allows the Canaanites to remain. We then see the climax in Judges 2, 1-5, where Israel did not remove the people, and they fall into worshiping false gods. Additionally, Lillian Ray Klein notes the next section is meant to parallel the opening section. The first section narrates the point of view of the Israelites, and the second narrates the point of view of God. Throughout the second section, we see that while Israel was having some initial military success, it is paralleled with simultaneous religious failure. Not only was Israel failing to keep the Torah in the ways listed in chapter 1, they were also worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. Thus, the second section concludes with God directly saying that despite that he was with them, he would no longer drive out the Canaanites from the land. Thus, Judges 1:19 would only suggest God was not powerful enough to stop iron chariots if we take it out of context. In context, the verse indicates God was angry with the idolatry and sin of Israel, and directly says because of this, he will no longer drive the Canaanites out of the land.